Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are launching suicide awareness. So, the month of September is National Suicide Awareness Month. And so there's a couple of other dates that I want to mention. So September 10th is International Suicide Prevention Day, and that is via the World Health Organization. So that is coming up this Monday as of the day that this episode launches. That is in just a few days. And then that day also kicks off National Suicide Awareness Week, which is September 10th through the 16th. That is through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I also want to mention an episode that we did 2 years ago now, and it's called Overcoming Suicidal Ideation. And this is by far our most impactful and our most popular episode. It's a really, really incredible story that we share. And so this is a friend of mine who overcame suicidal ideation, and he didn't attempt suicide that resulted in injury, but he was suicidal and was able to overcome that. And so that's his story. And it's a very incredible, vulnerable story. And we still appreciate the fact that he's willing to share that and to be open and vulnerable like that. And so episode is always worth listening to. It was just such a fantastic episode, and we appreciate him for being willing to share that. So, suicide rates have been on the rise for the last 20 years. Let's talk about why.
That's a good question. I wish we could answer it definitively. I don't know if we can. But so we're going to mention some statistics during this episode. And I think our listeners realize that you never have really up-to-date statistics. This particular one, though, is from last year, 2022. So if you look at suicide rates from 2011 to 2022, which is, about 11 years, it's up 16%. And there were a couple of years, I think it's like 2018, 2019, where it was either flat or down slightly, but it's certainly on the rise. And so you ask a really good question. I'm curious what you think the answer to that might be. What's going on that's leading the suicide rates to increase?
Social media, my first thought.
So tell me, well, I'm not a fan of social media, so I'm all about listening to that. Tell me, what is it about social media that you think impacts suicide?
So I think social media is the silent addiction that our entire country is gripping, and nobody will admit it. And so the problem with social media is you only get a single snapshot of somebody's life. And oftentimes people are choosing to share this tiny, perfect window that they have dressed up and made to look ideal. And that's all you see. You don't see everything else that's going on. You're just seeing this tiny picture perfect snapshot of someone's life. And you think, wow, they have such a great life. I wish my life could be like that. Mm-hmm. And it's depressing. And I mean, because of social media, we are just bombarded with just perfection all around us. And it's unachievable. I mean, it's already bad enough that where we live in a day and age where beauty and youth are celebrated, and it's celebrated to be thin and, or to be in good shape, or to look right, to look picture perfect like they do in the movies. That's bad enough. But then you throw in the social media and these people who do look like that, who, you see in everyday life. And it's like, wow, why can't I look like that? Or why don't I have what they have? Or their life is so perfect, mine isn't.
Yeah, but even the pictures you see are fake. A lot of them. I'm not saying all of them are fake, but we know that a lot of them are fake. They change the way they look. Mm-hmm. So I have 3 ideas, but one of them really is an extension of the social media one. Okay. And I think it's a big one. I think it's a disconnect from society. I hear this from a lot of people, that social media helps people be connected. Yes. I think on some level that's true. But I think really what we want are the in-person connections, and social media takes away from that. And so people think that they're having these online connections and these online relationships, and we know they're different. They're
Mm-hmm.
different for us emotionally. They're different in our brain, and so I think that, playing off that book I've mentioned quite a few times called "Lost Connections" by Johann Hari. That's one of his reasons that he thinks that there's an increase in depression, is that disconnect in society. And so I would take what you said as far as, you see this snapshot of somebody else's life. And what I think it ultimately does is lead to increased depression.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that social media might be the cause of some underlying problems that then on their way lead to increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts.
And I think you are right in that social media does help people stay connected. There are positives to social media,
Yes,
but
there
it
are.
but it does not, and it cannot, nor should people try to replace that with genuine human connection.
But I
So,
think a lot of people do. That's,
right.
and
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the bigger problems in my mind with social media, is that people think they can replace the in-person
And you can't.
connections, and
Y-
I don't think you can either.
Yeah. I mean, and it was a great thing and a wonderful thing amidst the pandemic. It was a great way for
Hmm.
people to stay
Yeah,
connected. But it did not replace that physical connection, and it doesn't. I mean, it's a great way to stay connected with people who maybe live in a different state.
far away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
far away. Curtis has talked before about wanting to just get off social media, and I'm like, well, our parents would probably kill us if we did that. Like, our parents would be really upset if we just decided to get off social media, because they love seeing posts and updates of our lives and seeing pictures. And there's other ways that you can do that. So I mean, it's not like you have to do social media, but you know, I think that it's a serious problem, especially among teenagers, is, you know, uh, youth today, they don't know how to connect in person
Right.
because they are so used to connecting to people online, and it's just not the same.
Yeah. So my son, lived in the Netherlands for about 3 or 4 years, and we never did. So we don't do social media, but
Hmm.
we talk to him every week on WhatsApp. And so
Yeah.
there are ways to connect with people who are far away. Maybe it just takes more effort because we had to, set up a time. Whereas I guess one of the benefits of social media is you can post something when it's convenient for you, and then someone looks at it when it's convenient for them.
Yeah.
And what we had to do was coordinate our schedules every week so that we had a time where we could talk. So there are ways to do it without social media, ways to
Hmm.
connect. So here are
Right.
the other two. So I think disconnect from society is one.
Hmm.
I think that increasing stressors,
Mm.
and I think, at least in our country, that most of those are around economics.
Okay.
And throughout the pandemic, what has happened? There's a split. There's a segment of society that does pretty well financially, but there is a huge segment of our society that is really struggling. People who have, say, full-time jobs, they aren't paying very much, but they can't afford rent. And I see online all the time people, for instance, a woman was denied a mortgage that would be $950 a month, but she's already paying $1,500 a month in rent.
Yes.
And so, whatever, I don't understand all the banking procedures, but whatever the process is that leads her to be able to get a mortgage, she doesn't qualify, but yet she's paying more than that now. If she got the mortgage and bought a house, she would be paying less than she is now. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And so, as I was talking to my daughter, Sierra, who's a physician, she thinks that a lot of it, the stressors, lack of insurance, because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have quality health care, that can be a real stressor, especially if you have children
Yes.
and you're lacking health care. And if you have to choose between having a meal or going to see a doctor, most people are probably going to say they're going to choose the meal. And
Right.
so going to the doctor becomes less of a priority. And so I think that's it. The increased stressors, mainly due to the economic conditions in our country for a lot of people, not
Hmm.
for everyone,
Right.
but for a lot of people. And then I think the third one, which is really a cultural problem. It's the unmet mental health needs.
Yeah.
That I think that I mean, this could be a financial economic issue as well, because it's really expensive to get mental health treatment. And so that's going to be way down on the list of people's priority. People who need it often don't have enough money to meet their basic needs anyway. And so they aren't going to go, get mental health needs. So I think as a society, we don't do that very well. And I think that, in the news, when, say when there are mass shootings, or I think often it's, and you and I have talked about this before. I don't know that it's really about the guns. I think it's about the unmet mental health needs
Yeah.
that as a culture we don't treat people very well who are on the margins.
Right.
And so I think it's really about those increased stressors, the unmet mental health needs, which are huge, I think, in our country. I think a lot of people with mental health issues could benefit from some sort of medication, but then again, there you go, it costs money, and the drug companies are out to certainly make a profit. And so I think it's a real problem that leads to increased depression, which then it leads to increased suicidal ideation, which ultimately leads to increased suicide attempts.
Yeah.
Those are my three anyway.
I think a lot of those, I would say, are probably, pretty valid. So feeling stuck would definitely, and so one of the things that we're going to get into is what drives people to suicide. And I think it's
Mhm.
a sense of hopelessness. They feel like they
Yes.
can't, it's this incredible hopelessness. And so, you try to get a loan at a bank to buy a house to better your life, and you can't, and it's just, sometimes it just seems like it's one thing after another for people. You feel like you're in this economic spiral, and your situation's never going to improve, and maybe you're never going to be able to adequately provide for your family. And so it drives hopelessness.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there are a lot of people who really feel stuck. I don't know what the rents are like where you live, but in Salt Lake City, the rents for apartments have skyrocketed. It's
Yeah,
really amazing. I don't know how people do it, really.
right.
And it's not that there's a lack of apartments. There's been such a building boom going on here that there are new apartments all over the place, but they're very expensive. So going back to hopelessness, I think it's exactly that. If I could say one thing, I think what leads people often to suicide is hopelessness. Although I ran into an interesting thing that I thought I'd mention just briefly. It's just an interesting idea. There's a French sociologist, he's dead now, Emile Durkheim is his name. He gave 4 types of suicide.
Okay.
And I'm not going to give the names because I think they're really confusing.
Okay.
And I'm just going to label them 1, 2, 3, and 4 because they were confusing for me. But that feels very French to me to have these confusing names.
Okay.
Anyway,
Yeah.
here's a couple of different types of, these aren't reasons. I think he's categorizing suicides into 4 different groups.
Okay.
The first is he calls social outcasts, people who are alone or outsiders, which I think goes back to what we were saying about being disconnected.
Hmm.
As a species, we really want that human connection. And so his first category is people who don't have that human connection and feel alone. Now, the second one is interesting because he sees it as almost the opposite, that you're too integrated into social groups. Now, what that means, he gives examples. So, for example, religious reasons. So the hijackers on 9/11 would fit into this category. They're willing to die. They're willing to commit suicide for an ideological reason.
Okay. Yeah.
And back, you're probably too young. Shows my age, but back in, I think it was during the Vietnam War, it was several times that I think they were Buddhist monks or some type of monks one thing they would do is set themselves on fire. They would kill themselves, but be a public display
Mm.
of them being as a form of protest.
Okay.
So for what was going on. And so he would categorize that in that particular group, that type of suicide. So some people believe that their death somehow benefits the group.
Hmm.
The next one would be another category, is I think one that is pretty common. Oh, it goes back possibly to the Great Depression.
Mhm.
when back in or I think it was 1921. So the stock market does this big crash, right? People
Yep.
lose an extreme financial loss all of a
Mhm.
sudden. I think for some people that happened in 2008 also. And so people who have an extreme loss, they see it and it increases their stress and they see it as the only way to escape that particular loss. And then the last one is one I'd never thought of. In fact, I had not heard of. He thinks that for some people, they're under too tight of control, too tight of societal control. Now, the example he gives, and maybe this is very narrowly restricted to South Korea, but South Korea's celebrities
Mhm.
feel like they're in the limelight all the time and they have to then live their lives according to these strict social customs and rules. And
Okay.
for some of them, it becomes so hard to do that they see their only way out as suicide to get away from it. So I thought it was interesting to split them up into these different categories just to think about it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I think that maybe should have been there's grief, profound grief.
Yes.
I mean, I feel like that should fit into a category because, I mean, social isolation doesn't necessarily fit because, I mean, you can be surrounded by people. In fact, I think you're often surrounded by people after a devastating event, and it can still feel so hopeless that, you feel like your only way out of this despair is to die.
Yeah, certainly an extreme sense of grief. We did that episode on grief quite a few episodes ago, and I think that when you have that profound grief, that I think often it leads to isolation.
Yeah,
Um,
it can.
the isolation, sense of hopelessness that things won't get any better. So really, there are these themes. No matter how we talk about it,
Hmm.
there are these themes that come back to hopelessness, stress, feeling like there's no other way out, you have no other options. Here's some other risk factors. So, certainly, as you mentioned, loss of a loved one or a job or a relationship, right? You're feeling hopeless. Family history of like childhood maltreatment, sexual abuse, things like that. Traumatic experiences, isolation, lack of social support. We've mentioned those, hopelessness. There is access to lethal means like guns and pills. But I think that in and of itself really follows the hopelessness. I mean, yeah, I think you have to get to a place where you're feeling hopeless first.
Yeah,
And then if you have easy access, say to guns and pills, then it makes it more likely that
right.
you're going to attempt it. And so, when probably next week we'll talk about, what do you do when someone you love or know is suicidal? And one of the things, even in my office, that we talk about is you lock the guns up. If you have guns, you check to see if there are any guns, you check to see what type of pills there are. And so you take away any method that's really easy to get to. So there's that. Stigmas associated with seeking help, the barriers to accessing mental health, history of mental health problem, depression, substance
Hmm.
abuse. And so those are all factors, I think, that increase your risk.
Right. And so we're getting better as a society at destigmatizing mental health, but I think there's still a long way to go. And another one that I thought of is potentially suicide as a means of escaping illness. So maybe you have cancer
Right,
or you have a
right.
terminal illness and you don't want to face it. And that certainly hopelessness. And, I've heard of this idea of death with dignity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think that's a whole other topic for a whole other subject, but I think it's worth talking about because there are certainly people who they're worried about leaving their family with an incredible amount of debt because of medical bills from some sort of medical issue that they're having. And it again, I think it's the sense of hopelessness is
But I
really
also
what
think
drives
that
people.
there's a quality of life issue too.
Yeah.
If you have there are many illnesses that people get where there's really no hope of recovery.
Yeah.
And so what you have is the prospect of staying alive and being in bed and being bedridden or not being able to have the life that you want to have. I think one of the hardest ones is certainly something like Alzheimer's
Yeah.
because we are our memories. I mean, that's how we define ourselves,
Hmm.
right? And so if you lose that, then who are you? You're
Right.
just this thing living in a body, right? Then you don't remember people who have meaning to you. So all those things that are important, like the connections,
Yep.
a sense of purpose, you don't have it. And so as a society, that's a societal problem, of course, and certainly there are some places, some states where you can do it, some countries where you can do it, where you can take your own life, if you're in that situation. But I think that on the whole, we don't treat people who are terminally ill very well.
Yeah. It's definitely, I think, something that is tricky because, doctors, they take this oath to do no harm. And well,
It depends on how you define harm,
right,
too. I mean,
exactly.
if I'm alive, but I'm in a bed, and let's say I'm comatose and I'm not going to come out of the coma,
Yeah,
and that seems pretty harmful to me.
right. Yeah. I think sympathy and compassion are really the main things, and so and on an honest conversation.
Going back to the doctors and do no harm, see, I think maybe they ought to shift that to maybe their goal is, or their job is to relieve suffering.
Mm, yeah,
And so if people are really suffering and you can do something to relieve that suffering, isn't that important?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. But, I mean, and it's a complicated issue, and because you
Mhm.
also get into the realm of beliefs and,
Yeah, no, you're
there are
right. It is. This
you
is not
know
an easy issue. If it were easy, we would have solved it. But
right. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
because it is complicated by moral beliefs.
Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to get into, to wrap up is suicide in men versus women.
Mhm.
So kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week. So men are more likely to die by suicide, and that mainly has to do with the fact that men are more likely to use lethal means.
Right.
So,
So I have some statistics if you want to, and
yeah.
these are from 2021, I think. So they're a couple of years old, but it's the latest that I could find. And so here's just some information about suicide. The prevalence of serious suicidal thoughts, so suicidal ideation, is highest among young adults aged 18 to 25.
Mm, yeah,
Now, I think part of that has to do with feeling hopeless again about the future. I mean,
right.
for a lot of young people, they do feel hopeless.
And
Um,
also, that's kind of a scary time, right? I
mhm.
mean, it's a difficult transitioning from childhood to adulthood. I mean, that's hard, and you start out at the bottom, right? I mean, most people, you go off to college and you're a poor college student. That can be very
R-
difficult.
Right, but if you look at, so when I got out of college, I really didn't worry about getting a job. First time as an engineer. I mean, I went around. I had 3 offers. I think I could be in
Mm,
Seattle, I could be in Sacramento, or one in Salt Lake, and so it was easier. And I think a lot of people now they're in college and they don't have any hope for what it's going to be like after.
yeah,
And so I think that's the hopelessness. But again, in 2021 anyway, with suicide attempts, the prevalence of suicide attempts was highest among that same group, young adults age 18 to 25. But as a group, the highest demographic group, American Indian and Alaskan Native adults. And I
interesting.
think that a lot of that probably is that hopelessness that their life isn't going to get any better. But if we go to suicide, so the differences between male and female. So we have 4 different categories: firearms, now what they call suffocation, which I'm assuming is hanging.
Probably.
They don't call it hanging, but it's probably that's what they're saying. Firearms, suffocation, poisoning, and then a catch-all category for everything else called other. So with firearms, almost 58% of male attempts are with a firearm, whereas only 33% with females. So there's a difference in what it is they're choosing to use.
Hmm.
Now, around suffocation, it's about the same, 29% for females and about 27% for males. Poisoning, however, is another big difference. Women choose to use poison, which is pills. And
Right.
so that's what we're talking about, probably medication. 29% of women choose to take pills, whereas only about 8% of men do. And then the other category, which I really don't know what's in the other category, 9% for women, 7% for men. So when you talk about men are successful at completing suicide, it's most likely because of the firearm issue. They choose the more violent way.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah. And so what about suicidality? I think
Mhm.
women tend to feel suicidal more often than men.
That's true. Well, the only way we know that is that they're reporting it.
Right.
And I think there's a pretty good consensus that men underreport this.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And that's true statistically. I don't know if in actuality it's true. I would guess it's the highest, well, somewhat higher for men anyway, because they underreport it. Women also will seek mental health treatment, more rapidly than men will. And
And
so, and
yeah,
that's where it's probably being reported
right.
as well.
And as same disclaimer as last week, these are generalizations
Yeah,
because these are
right.
trends, these are patterns. There are certainly women who attempt suicide via firearms. There are certainly men who
Mhm.
attempt suicide via poisoning. These are just statistics. And,
Right. But if you look at the statistics, firearm is the choice that the most make, or the
yeah,
majority, 33%. And actually, it's pretty close. 33%, 29%. It's pretty evenly spaced with women between firearms, hanging, and taking pills. Yeah.
right. And so, next week we're going to talk about suicide prevention. And so, we'll get into that more, but really what it comes down to, suicide as a whole, I think one of the biggest things that we can do to combat this is just to break the stigma.
Well, it's break the stigma, but it's also to make services more readily available. Because if you look at protective factors, certainly
Yeah.
family and community support are important.
Hmm.
But easy access. So easy access to a variety of supports for mental health issues. And I don't think we have that.
Not enough. We certainly
No.
don't
I
have
don't know.
enough.
Mm-mm.
Now, we are making steps, but I think the steps are a little bit too slow
Mhm.
for the rate that is rising. So we can't talk about suicide without bringing up the suicide hotline, which is
Right.
988. And you can text or call. And so I think part of the reason why they made that available via text is because you're more likely to reach young people. Young people are more likely to
Mhm.
text than they are
Right.
to make
That's
um,
true.
a phone call.
Yeah.
And so that number is always good to have on hand. It used to be a whole phone number, and so it's kind of like it's like 911 for suicide.
Yeah. It's really improved. It's a good service, which has
Yeah,
been there, what, a couple of years now, I think?
I think so. I think it
Yeah.
might have been last year
Hmm.
actually, but yeah, it is a newer thing. I mean, as a country, we're getting better. I know counseling is more accessible than it has been. I know workplaces in particular are covering insurance is covering mental health services is covering counseling more often. But you have to be in an economic position to do so. So usually you have to have a job with benefits.
Right.
And there's a
A
large number of
lot of
people.
people don't.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of people are, they're working part-time. They're working a couple of part-time jobs. You only get benefits if you're full-time in most cases.
Yeah.
So,
No,
I
that's
think, and certainly if you are just feeling suicidal and you just can't get out, the emergency room is always an option because they cannot and will not turn you away no matter what your financial situation is like, no matter what your economic status is. That
right.
is certainly always an option, but it's not a very good option because I don't know anyone who wants to just,
Well, it's a good option to keep you alive, but that's about
yeah,
it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so to actually address what issues led you there,
yeah.
that's not what they're for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, I think we need more empathy in the world. And,
Mhm.
I think if we had more empathy for these kinds of things, I think people would be more willing to do something about it if they could realize these social issues.
I also think we need to take care of each other better.
Yeah. Everybody needs a community, everybody needs a
Yeah.
sense of belonging. Right. And it's not that suicide doesn't happen in communities, right? You can have a strong knit community and there can still be a suicide, but it's a lot lower if you're
Yeah,
part of a community.
right. It comes back to those themes. Connection with
Yeah.
other people is really important. It's important for that, for, suicide risk. It's important for our long-term happiness. We
Yeah.
know that.
Yep. So again, 988, if you or anyone you know is suicidal, call that number or text that number and get yourself some help. Don't go through it alone. So,
Yes.
talk about it is really what it comes down to. So next week we're going to get into suicide prevention, and in particular, we're going to walk you through what to do when somebody is threatening suicide. If someone right there is suicidal. So we're going to go through that along with some other good things of how we can prevent suicide. It will be a good episode, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.